All right, well, we'll get started. How about that? So it is good to see everyone this morning, and I am excited that we're here to have another session of Sage. And in this particular conversation of Sage, we're talking about the sort of current discourse and the current discourse is sort of the idea about living with difference, especially when we're talking about the Israel and Palestinian situation. And I come at this from a perspective that the Jewish community is in many ways torn by its disagreement around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I wonder, right, how our community can be sustained despite these disagreements. Today, we're going to explore the sort of some of the ideas behind pluralism and tolerance and the deviance and the reflection in Jewish sources that help us to gain an understanding of the ways in which Jewish communities can accommodate difference and develop strategies of acceptance and belonging, particularly when we have differences. So this morning, we're going to learn from Rabbi Daniel Hartman. And we're going to, he's the executive director of the Shalom Hartman Institute. We're going to learn from him, and then we're going to look at some Jewish sources and have some conversation. So as I share the video, I invite you to mute yourselves, and we will play the video, and then have an opportunity to discuss, and have a conversation about what is said. So hold on for 1 second.
The North American Jewish community is the most religiously diverse and in many ways the most religiously tolerant Jewish community in history. The diversity is mind-blowing. It is not just simply that we belong to different synagogues and affiliate through different denominations. What constitutes Judaism, what is perceived to be required of a Jew, is disagreed upon at every level. It's almost impossible to identify anything that every Jew who calls themselves such agrees to. The secret to North American Jewish communal survival has been that this diversity is coupled with a deep level of religious pluralism or tolerance, encompassing most within the liberal Jewish community, from modern Orthodox to conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, post-denominational, secular, and the new denomination that is referred to as nones. While individuals may choose to not eat at another's home or go to their synagogue, or even see the other as Jewish enough for their children, overall, the community has created a large tent philosophy, a large umbrella approach to others who define themselves as Jews, and basically grant to almost all a seat around the Jewish communal table. When it comes to difference about Israel, however, this tolerance disappears, and the liberal Jewish community becomes transformed into an ultra-Orthodox one. When it comes to Israel, it is as if we've lost our ability to assimilate difference, and our commitments to pluralism and tolerance evaporate. It is possible that our community really is not as liberal as we thought it was, and that what we are assuming to be tolerance is really indifference. Most Jews don't care that much about Judaism, and as a result, it doesn't bother them in the deepest regions of their soul when somebody observes Jewishly in a different way. It is very easy to be tolerant towards difference about which you don't care about.
Rabbi, we can no longer hear the sound.
No. Same members with whom I share beliefs around gender lost are about differences concerned.
Can you hear the sound now? Okay.
Israel is that our traditional, denominational, and institutional divides don't insulate us. If I belong to a particular
Sound's gone again.
questions of Jewish faith and practice, those same members with whom I share beliefs around gender, dietary laws, Shabbos observance, and intermarriage, and precisely because of that, I feel comfortable belonging here and choose to belong here as distinct from there, disagree, often quite vociferously, about Israel. This disagreement is not mitigated by institutional distance, but hits us in our homes and confronts us face to face. It is much harder to tolerate difference in this context. This is also the reason why it is often hard for rabbis who lead a communal consensus on religious issues within his or her community to speak about Israel. Regardless of what position he or she takes, it is bound to anger and alienate some members of the community. The consequence of this is that our community is not prepared for the divisive and diverse positions that we are encountering around Israel. Nowhere is the disagreement around Israel more profound than on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Lovers of Israel, people who are equally committed to peace as they are to security and to Israel's survival. People equally committed to Jewish values as they are committed to our right of self-defense. Disagree as to how to best help Israel and how Israel ought to conduct itself and what policies it must implement. These disagreements are deep, and my friends, they're both going to get deeper, and they're here to stay. As a community, we need to not merely think about our policies towards Israel, but our policies towards each other. As a community, we need to prepare for how we live despite our differences. If we do not, then besides dividing and separating from each other, the safe alternative will be simply to not talk about Israel. The best way for us to live as a community is to take Israel off the table of our public discourse, because anytime we talk about it, we're going to be alienating somebody. An Israel that we don't talk about, however, is also an Israel that will become less significant in our lives as Jews. Living with difference and finding a way to maintain social cohesion is not unique either to the Jewish community or to the issue of Israel. Every community has, by definition, had to learn how to deal with difference. Every social structure is invariably going to have members who disagree. How a society deals with difference is the key to its ability to sustain itself and survive. Cults, they have no ability to assimilate difference, and that's why they ultimately split themselves into oblivion. Healthy societies naturally must develop mechanisms to avoid this destructive outcome. Just as we are able to assimilate and live with religious difference, so too we have to learn how to live with disagreements about Israel. We need to reconnect and relearn the Torah of living with difference and apply it to our disagreements regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This Torah is built on the use and balancing of the following four categories: pluralism, tolerance, tolerable deviance, and intolerable deviance. Let's first define these categories. Pluralism is that category which we use when we encounter difference, which are perceived to be of equal value. It's where somebody is doing something and you say, that's not the way I do it, but I can see that doing it that way is as right as the way I do it. The differences are in the area of preference. There is no assessment of an evaluative distinction between the two. In our tradition, the classic reference for pluralism is, these and these are the words of the living God. Both the opinions of Hillel and the opinions of Shammai are equally authentic. Now, pluralism is sometimes misperceived as the dominant social tool for assimilating difference. In fact, pluralism is more often than not a very narrowly used category because opinions are usually based on ideological beliefs and commitments. And consequently, the other's position is invariably perceived as inferior. If, for example, I vote Republican or Democrat, if I'm a Reformed Jew and somebody else is conservative or Orthodox, there might be some dimension in which I could state that, yes, everybody is equally authentic and everybody is equally valuable, and I'm merely choosing between equally valuable perspectives. At times, I might recognize the complexity inherent in an issue or the limitation of my own knowledge, and as a result, refrain from any negative judgment or assessment of the other. But more often than not, my position is based on the belief that my position is more correct than yours. For example, if I believe that gender equality is a value, it is very difficult for me to be pluralistic about societies where it is not practiced. I might respect a person's right to disagree and to live in accordance with their choices, but I don't ascribe to them equal value. The minute I say that my opinion is more correct, even if I condition it with the qualification for me, I move outside of the domain of pluralism. If the only way that I could assimilate difference and live with somebody else is by being pluralistic, very quickly, I will give up on my ability to coexist with others. Pluralism is simply not a sufficiently broad enough category for me to live with others who are not merely different from me, but with whom I disagree and whom I think are wrong. Here, the second category, what is in fact the most significant of categories for social cohesion, tolerance, comes into play. What is tolerance? As the philosopher Bernard William posits, tolerance is for the intolerable. You don't say to someone, you know what, I think you're great, and therefore I'm willing to tolerate you. No, you tolerate something that you think is wrong, or at the very least, less valuable. Now, why do you tolerate? You either tolerate something because you believe it is still within a spectrum of acceptable differences. I might think you're wrong, but I don't think you're devastatingly wrong. Or I realize that the situation is complex, that there are nuances, and that within these nuances, there is room for difference, even though I might have an opinion as to which is better. In addition, I could activate tolerance because I believe that even though your position is wrong, you have a fundamental right, a core right to say it and to advocate for it. I recognize that I don't control the public space. While I might fantasize and try to figure out how to make a bunch of mini-me's, how do I get people to see things exactly through the prism that I see them? The fact is that a community is not constructed that way. I tolerate you, I accept you, because I accept that this society is yours just as much as it is mine. Tolerance is about giving space to another's opinion to exist within the community and to shape its identity, to recognize that around the table, there must be room for people who you think are wrong. The third category, while often overlooked, is as important as tolerance, and that is the category of tolerable deviance. Now, deviance in general is for that difference that you don't tolerate. Deviance is the category for the red line, for difference that you believe to be so mistaken that it is clearly bad and destructive for the community. Every society, every social group, every ideology has a category of deviance. And there has never existed any social structure which does not have a line which its members are not allowed to cross. The critical issue is, however, where do you put that line? For if you put it in the wrong place, if you call deviant that which you should be treating as tolerable, you destroy your community. Let's use the analogy of driving in a car. And let's say you're driving in a 65-mile zone and you're going between 60 and 70. If you're driving in that range, we treat the different speeds with pluralism. I like to call pluralism that speed for when your children are driving that you don't comment about it. If they start going 75, you'll tell them to slow down. No one's giving them a ticket, but you don't agree with the speed. That's tolerance. And as always, you tolerate things amongst others more than you tolerate them when done by your children. When you start driving 80 miles an hour, that's already deviance. If the police see you, they're going to stop you and give you a ticket. That behavior is simply not acceptable and activates sanctions. Sanctions being the key defining feature distinguishing the tolerable from the deviant. But not all sanctions are the same. There's a very interesting difference in perception and in the law between driving 80 miles an hour and driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. If you're driving 80 miles an hour and the police catch you, they're going to give you a ticket. But then they do something very strange. They let you continue driving. But if you're a danger to yourself and those around you, why are you allowed to get back on the road? If they catch you driving under the influence of alcohol, they're not going to simply give you a ticket. They're not going to say, okay, wait here for 3 hours until you sober up and then continue driving again. They're going to take away your license. They're going to take you off the road. Within the category of deviance, we make subtle distinctions. There's deviance, which in a certain sense we tolerate, and deviance, which we don't tolerate. And in knowing that difference lies one of the most important secrets to social cohesion. Tolerable deviance is for behavior that you refuse to accept as defining what constitutes acceptable behavior. But even though you define it as deviant, by and large, you still make room for the person who acts in a deviant manner around the table. After the ticket, they return to the road, rejoin society. The speeding is deviant, but it doesn't define them. It is the intolerable deviant who you reject, both the opinion and the person. You move them to the margins. You put them in jail. You take them off the road. You exclude them from your community. You avoid having relationships with them. You create barriers between them and you. How do we distinguish between tolerable and intolerable deviance? Sometimes the difference is dependent on the severity of the crime. Speeding 80 miles an hour is not as dangerous to others as driving under the influence. In most instances, however, the primary difference between tolerable deviance and intolerable deviance is simply the number of people who perpetrate the act. When a large number of people do something wrong, it by definition becomes tolerable deviance, because a community cannot erect a boundary and marginalize a significant percentage of its society. When a people cease to obey a law, in many ways, it ceases to function as a law. A classic example of tolerable deviance is adultery. Everybody knows that adultery is wrong, dishonest, harmful, and hurtful. Yet the fact is that we don't treat it as intolerable deviance. It's wrong, but we don't respond to it in the same way we would respond, for example, to incest or to sex with minors. It's not simply a result of an assessment of the inherent wrongfulness, but the fact that functionally, the number of people who commit adultery has caused the line to be redrawn. From being beyond the pale, compared in the 10 Commandments with murder and theft, it has simply become a wrong norm. One can talk about it to one's friends, boast about it, joke about it, complain about being caught, no different than speeding 80 miles an hour. You don't joke about driving under the influence or incest. That is the difference between tolerable and intolerable deviance. The fact is that a community does not only assimilate difference, which it values. It doesn't only assimilate difference, which is within a spectrum of qualitative value disagreements. It also assimilates difference, which it thinks is wrong, when a large number of members of its community adopt it. Now let's take this discussion and apply it to how we think about Israel. There are times when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you're going to encounter people saying something which will cause you to say, do you know what? I didn't think of that. That's not my opinion, but I can see the value in your point. Those are going to be easy moments, but they're also going to be very rare. More often than not, you're going to hear people saying something like, I think Israel should unilaterally withdraw from Judea and Samaria. Inside and sometimes out loud, you'll be screaming, what, are you crazy? How could we unilaterally withdraw from Judea and Samaria? Don't you see what happened when we unilaterally withdrew from Gaza? You want to have missiles coming out of Ramallah? Israel cannot move out of Judea and Samaria and has to maintain the status quo until which time we have a trustworthy Palestinian partner who's able to implement a larger peace process, which will bring full security to the state of Israel. At the same time, others are going to be shouting, what, are you crazy? You want to wait until then and continue to occupy another people? You want us to continue to be alienated by the world? If we don't take a proactive position, nothing will ever change. I know there's dangers, but we're strong enough. We need to be strong and find a way, for otherwise we will cease to be a democratic state. And that is the greatest danger of all. Have you heard these arguments? Have you screamed with certainty one of them? Of course you have. In this room, every one of you will have one position they prefer over the other. How do you deal with the one you reject? If you call that opinion intolerably deviant, then you've removed half the people from the Jewish community, or you've removed a whole age group from the tent. If you do that, then we're no longer a community, and Israel is no longer a part of Jewish life. Israel becomes that which divides and undermines Jewish peoplehood. Our challenge as a community is to use tolerance more often, to recognize that Israel belongs to us all, even to those whose views differ from our own. But where it gets even more challenging is that as a community, we also have to use tolerable deviance. Around the Jewish communal table, there are going to be people who are one-staters and unilateralists. The fact is that one-statists and unilateral two-statists are factually part of the conversation. Some are going to say, I think it's the job of the Jews of North America to support all policies of the elected government of Israel. And others will argue, how can you support Israel when it's hurting itself? Doesn't love mean to criticize and not to enable someone to hurt themselves? Some will claim it's our job as lovers of Israel to criticize Israel publicly and to push it as far as we can. And others will counter, how can you do that? Your children aren't on the line. How dare you force Israel to do that which it doesn't want to do? The fact is that both, and many positions in between, are part of our community's relationship with Israel. It's going to be tough. We're going to encounter positions that we think are profoundly wrong and ought to be deviant, beyond the line and pale. Yet the minute they become prevalent in our community, our task is to recognize that we have to treat them as tolerable deviants. Even though I disagree as deeply as I do, they're still part of the life of my community. I might not invite that person to my home or into my synagogue. I might not go to that lecture. I might choose to not support that organization. But we have to recognize that it is part of the conversation. If Israel is going to become something that we as North American Jews talk about, we have to begin to make room at the table for some of those opinions that we disagree with profoundly. We have to open the doors to our community to ideas that are commonly held, even if not widely advocated. If not, instead of standing for and with Israel, we will be creating the foundation for the demise of our community, and with it, the relationship with Israel that is so important to both our Jewish identities as well as the well-being of Israel itself. Thank you.
Okay, so the lecture to this morning has dealt with a lot of about the idea of pluralism and tolerance and tolerable deviance and what was considered intolerable deviance. And I hope that Rabbi Hartman was able to sort of like push it back into what this is, how these definitions become important with regards to the notion of what happens in Israel, right? So if pluralism is that category which we use when we encounter differences which are perceived to be of equal value, pluralism is where somebody is doing something and we sort of say to ourselves, that's not the way that I would do it, but I can see that you're doing it the way that you're doing it is just as right as mine, right? Pluralism is sometimes misperceived as sort of assimilating difference. However, pluralism is in this case very narrowly used category where opinions and behaviors and ideological beliefs and commitments are differing, but they are in fact acceptable. Tolerance is not pluralism, and is in many ways the most significant category for social cohesion, because intolerance, right, this is the category that he defines as dealing with a difference that we think is wrong, or at the very least less valuable. However, we can tolerate it, and we can tolerate the difference because we believe it is still within a spectrum of acceptable differences. Now, he then defines tolerable deviance as this sort of third category, right? That it is also saying, and he's saying that it's important for social cohesion, right? Deviance in general is that idea that it's just sort of different, that we don't really tolerate, but tolerable deviance is recognized, not just as the red line, but something that is not great, but that red line has sort of is more acceptable than maybe previous generations had sort of described. Now, in an intolerable deviance, right, is a category that we would sort of reject outright as someone holding an opinion that is just unacceptable to our communal norm. And in Rabbi Hartman's sort of perspective, it's important to be able to distinguish between the tolerable and intolerable deviance, right? How we distinguish between tolerable and intolerable, right, really, really matters. And he uses the example of, speeding, right? That if I were to get a ticket on the highway on 485 and, going 80 miles per hour, and, that is not great. But it's not like I should be prevented from driving ever again, right? However, right, if I had a DUI and put people, on the road in danger, that would potentially considered, right, something that would be like an intolerable deviance, something that should not be okay. He used adultery as another example of something that's become a little more tolerable, a more tolerable deviance, as opposed to something like incest or relationships with minors. And so then he applies it to the issue of Israel. And I think this is what, in that framework of pluralism and tolerance and deviance, like why that really matters. And his challenge to us as a community is to try to figure out how we use our tolerance more, to recognize that Israel belongs to all of us, even to those whose views really differ from our own. And as a community, we also, he says, sort of have to think more about a tolerable deviance around the Jewish communal table, where people who might hold positions that we see as being sort of unacceptable, right? He uses the sort of one state versus two state conversation. Those, what he's saying is that if we sort of just outright disregard those who have something that we might just sort of determine as a tolerable deviance, right, if we sort of disregard them altogether, if we, to use another, phrase that's, more common lately, if we cancel them, right, then what we are doing in effect is both affecting our Jewish community and our ability to talk about Israel and our ability to connect as Jews with Israel. And so this framework that I think that he's sort of set out for us is an important framework for having a conversation about how we talk about Israel. And so I want to sort of like run through this as sort of as an example. And I have no idea what just happened there. It was asking me about what language I wanted to write something in. And I want to share a screen. Let me share a screen for 1 second. Hold on for 1 second. All right. So here in this conversation, and this is where I'm going to ask you to unmute, is to be able to sort of think about, like, as an example in our own community. What's an example in our own community? Maybe it's our families, maybe it's the synagogue, maybe it's the Levine JCC or the Federation, or sort of, what we see as Jewish differences regarding observance, customs, laws, or beliefs, and how those Jewish differences sort of met with pluralism, tolerance, or deviance. And I probably, frankly, should have add this as like as tolerable deviance and intolerable deviance. Yeah, sorry. So go ahead. Who unmuted? Sarah, go ahead.
Politics.
Okay, so where would you see politics?
I see it in all three things, but in the way that it's such as January 6th, there was a definite intolerable deviance, whereas and also that the elections were not. But I don't think that politics carries on our Jewish beliefs in caring for one another. There's an inequality.
So we can have in other words, right? We can have tolerance of people's different political beliefs in our Jewish community, right? Recognizing that there might be people who are liberal and there might be people who are more conservative, and that we can tolerate that. But then the intolerable deviance, at least for some, is an example like January 6th, right? As being beyond sort of the potentially the pale. Okay, another example from our community of sort of differences regarding observance or even customs or laws or beliefs that we're sort of met with. So anyone else want to talk about that? Give examples of that.
Voting rights bill.
Okay, and so where do you see that?
I don't even know where to put it. Either tolerable difference or intolerable difference. It's sort of like, do you need some level of restriction, or there should be no restriction whatsoever? So it's a blend type of thing.
And in terms of our community, do you see it as that we have sort of that where does the voting rights conversation, is it mixed within the tolerable or intolerable? Like where would you see that within our own community?
I tolerable difference, deviance, and intolerable deviance type of thing. The idea that you can have certain restrictions in terms of who can and cannot vote, but you can make it so intolerable that you're just wrong. That's intolerable. I will not accept that.
Okay. Now let's get politics and sort of certain things like that out of the way first for a sec, if we can. let's try to give some examples. I'm wondering if people would give some examples of other things that are, within the congregation, within the Jewish community here in Charlotte, with things that we see as differences regarding observance or customs or laws, and sort of how we deal with that. So Marcia, I see your hand politely raised. Thank you so much.
I was thinking of how people sort of define their practice on Shabbat.
Okay.
So I've heard, for instance, quote, working on Shabbat is acceptable if it's not your regular job. So if it's something you're doing as a volunteer, then it's okay to do it.
Got it. Right. Like, in other words, like if you're doing like some type of good in the world, right, then working on Shabbat, like, is okay. That might be right. So you would see this as actually would you see that as Marcia, you lowered your hand already, but would you see that as within the Jewish community, would you see that as tolerance?
I would, if you're only talking about the Reform community, I'd see that as pluralism. But if you're talking about the Jewish community as a whole, I'd say it's tolerance.
All right. Great. Bob and then Sarah.
Yeah, I think it also depends on which point of view you have, how that's. So let's take an issue like same-sex marriage being performed within the Jewish community.
Great, let's do that.
We would put it certainly under tolerance. Some Jews who might have questions about it might put it as a tolerable deviance. They wouldn't want it in their congregation, but they can understand and respect it if it occurs somewhere else. And then there are people who will look at it maybe from the very Orthodox who would say it's intolerable.
Correct. Right. And that's exactly right. And by the way, and this is a perfect example same-sex marriage is a great example of something that has shifted over time, right? I mean, same-sex marriage was an intolerable deviance in the United States for a very, very long time, and only recently, right? Last 10, 15 years has moved from tolerable deviance to tolerance of it, right? And let's say in the last 20 years, in terms of that, a lot of the movement, you can actually see how that category has actually shifted over time. Does that make sense?
Why would it not also be under pluralism? If you
it could be. It could be. I think it really depends on where. Yeah, that's right. All right, Sarah.
Well, I think it goes to all the different sects of Judaism come under pluralism, and yet for some it comes as intolerable.
So what do you mean? So you mean like the different streams of Judaism?
Right, starting with Chabad and Orthodox and conservative. Just their lack of joining together is almost a tolerable deviance, but at times it's intolerable to one group over the other's practice.
Right, but if you take a look at Shalom Park, right, just take a look at Shalom Park and the uniqueness of Shalom Park, right? I mean, one of the things that I would actually argue is that on this park we have literally everything. And if I have to have a conversation with the Chabad rabbi, it's a phone call away. It's a conversation, or Orthodox congregation. It's a phone call away. There is a tolerance within, our Jewish clergy on an annual basis at the Hebrew Cemetery here in Charlotte, right? We are actually, we gather together with Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, renewal, right, to do a service of memory and healing at the Hebrew Cemetery every single year, and there's no question about any of the congregations or rabbis' participation, or clergy's participation. So it's interesting. Now that I would also say Charlotte is interestingly uniquely different than some places, right? Where there are, what I would actually say is that some streams of Judaism, to your point, Sarah, in some locations cannot accept sort of the other streams of Judaism. But in Charlotte, we've got a lot of tolerance for the diversity of Jewish practice.
I think that goes though more at the top, at the rabbinic level, than it does at the members of the congregation, including different people in their activities to make it a better activity.
Okay, that's great. And by the way, it may not be totally at the rabbinic level either, right? Like, so it may be surface level, and it may not be as in depth as I think what you're saying. That's great. Marcia, and then anyone will take someone else. And I want to sort of move this towards a conversation about Israel.
So speaking of Israel, I was thinking that the way that they require only Orthodox rabbis to perform marriage ceremonies would put that, I think, in intolerable deviance from their perspective, because they don't recognize the rights of, for instance, a reform or a conservative rabbi to perform that kind of ceremony.
Okay, so in Israel, right, the Orthodox rabbinical control of life cycle, like marriage, right, in conversion, the Orthodox see it as actually, I have this incorrect. What I should say is, in Israel, sorry, reform or liberal officiation of life cycle, like marriage or conversion, is considered intolerable by Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
And similarly, I would say that what the reform and progressive movements have been arguing with regards to Israel is that the Orthodox stronghold and control over all life cycles like marriage or conversion, right, actually is not tolerant, and is therefore is sort of an intolerable deviance. It is not tolerant of the idea that there is more than one stream. All right. So when we start to talk about this, there's other issues that sort of, absolutely could have, emerged that, that I will just sort of, I'll sort of talk about, but issues like, gender or, sexual identity, right? Or issues that I'm surprised no one really brought up, intermarriage, right? Or issues like kashrut. Right. And if you really look at this and you started thinking about like in terms of gender and sexual identity and intermarriage and kashrut, we have seen probably, and maybe this is more of a question, is this, how has the Jewish community dealt with the differences in gender and sexual identity and intermarriage and kashrut since the 1950s compared to today?
Definitely progressed. But are we talking about in the US or in Israel?
Well, let's talk about the United States. Let's talk about our community only.
Well,
Which part of our community? Because I think the reform, the conservative, all the way to the very Orthodox, there's a different arc in those communities.
That's correct. Okay, great. So, but let's talk about let's just first deal with the Reformed Jewish community.
Rabbi, I think that from the 50s to now in Reform Judaism, we opened up and looked at our Torah and our history, and we've decided how these issues can be looked at in modern day instead of from historically thousands of years ago. So we've become willing to move them into the present, and so we tolerate them. I guess maybe it's become tolerant deviance because it's not everybody agrees with it, but it's part of our culture now.
Okay, Marcia?
Well, there are still some Reform rabbis who will not perform an intermarriage, correct?
There are, although the numbers have greatly increased over the years. I mean, greatly increased over the years. Yeah.
So more are performing intermarriages.
Yeah, I would say a considerable more. Or if they themselves aren't, they are willing to have colleagues at their own congregations who do. Right? Like, in other words, that they're not making the statement that just because I do means that no one else can.
Got it. So they allow other rabbis, perhaps even from outside of their synagogue, to come in and perform the ceremony. Okay.
Yep. It's much more common in some Jewish communities that may have a little more conservative leanings, but it's just much more common and much more sort of accepted practice right now. Much more so. I mean, I've seen a shift since I've started being a rabbi in 2007. Honestly, yeah.
Okay.
There have been more women rabbis than there were originally.
When you talk about originally, most definitely.
Well, I meant going back. You said to like the 50s.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the acknowledgement of that by other groups.
Yep. Exactly. So here's the sort of question that I think is sort of to bring this home as we sort of talk about, Israel. And this is sort of the conversation that I think is really important, is that it makes me, as we sort of talk about these big issues, it makes me sort of wonder, and I'm going to paste the question in the Word document, which is, how does our community handle differences about Israel and Israeli politics? And would you say that we see it as pluralism or tolerance or tolerable deviance or intolerable deviance? How when it comes to Israeli politics, how is it that we sort of align and discuss things? Sarah, hold on. I want to give some other people a chance to sort of to take a moment.
No problem.
Yeah. Judy?
I think it's a combination. It depends what the issue is. You're not the same across the board for every issue. There's also, to me, a subjective component to tolerant and totally, what the last category was. What are we calling it? Deviant tolerant?
Yeah, deviant. Yeah.
Because here's the example that I was thinking, and of course, maybe it's silly. He used the example of being tolerant, someone going over this zone is 70, you go 75, as opposed to the person who is driving drunk. But if both things result in death, did it really matter whether the person was going 75 or was drunk? The outcome was the same.
Well, I mean, yeah, no, results do matter.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying, but I do see, to your question, that I think it depends what the issue is. What part of Israel, what part of the politics do I agree or disagree with? And then I have a different position.
Yeah, I mean, so that's interesting. So I appreciate that. I mean, I think that the question that I would sort of ask is, are we as tolerant about differing opinions when it comes to discussion around Israel?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I want to raise a question because I'm not knowledgeable enough. Maybe other people in the audience can. But the issue that's always been of concern to me is defending Israel. The universal draft, if you will, in Israel. And the fact that the Orthodox, especially the ultra-Orthodox, are not held to the same standard. To the best of my knowledge, that's not true here. we don't have a draft anymore, but I don't believe that all Jews in America are of the same opinion about whether or not, if we needed to, we would, as Americans, this is the issue, am I American first or am I Jewish first? Defend our country if we needed to. I'd be interested in hearing other people's opinions.
Okay, anyone want to respond to that?
Are there differences about how does our community handle such differences, or do they never come up?
Well,
No, I
they
think
certainly have come up. They certainly have come up. I mean, I volunteered into service in the Vietnam War, and there were an awful lot of people in the Jewish community who I took a lot of flack for having done that.
That you took a lot of flack for volunteering for the service.
Yeah, when I came back, there were a lot of people who, you know, had some not so nice things to say about the fact that I had supported whatever they wanted to think about the war, and they hadn't.
Yeah,
I think, just go along with what Bob said, I feel, you know, we don't live there, so we don't really, we can't really speak knowledgeably about the issues in Israel, but I feel very strongly, having served in the military as well, not in Vietnam, but during the war, that all Israelis should be prepared to defend their country from annihilation or overwhelming war, and that is not the case.
right. But what I would argue is that I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't disagree. That's a matter for internal Israel conversation, and the internal Israel conversation that they're having is what is their level of tolerance and or tolerable deviance or intolerable deviance around that. Right. And right, that effectively inside of Israel, there, you know, for a long time, there has been a tolerable deviance around ultra-Orthodox serving in or not serving in the military. Okay. And it got to a place, particularly during the Second Intifada and after the Second Intifada, when you know, so many secular Israelis were really outcrying and saying, listen, our boys and girls are dying, right, to protect us and to protect the whole state, the whole state. And the answer of, well, we're praying for, we're doing our duty by praying is not putting people's lives on the line to save the state. And there became a question about actually a movement around whether or not that tolerable deviance became an intolerable deviance inside of Israel. And that's an interesting line that begins that inside of Israel begins to get drawn. And it's a real issue that they're dealing with, because it was sort of considered, it was somewhere between tolerance and tolerable deviance. And as more people's lives and sons and daughters were killed, you know, it became an intolerable deviance, you know, for sure. So Israel has to sort of, you know, confront that. And that's okay for Israel to confront. I mean, that's something that Israel, like our society, would have to confront too, if we were to institute the draft and we were seeing some type of sort of intolerable dynamic around the draft. Bob, then Sarah, Bob, you're saying something?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to also realize is that we live in a world where intolerable deviance has become more of the norm than it used to, where we stop having conversations and we just scream at each other, having taken predispositions to activities. Just on a personal basis, I mean, my wife and I have a strong disagreement. That's hard to believe in 40 years of marriage that we have one, but it's one of many, where I grew up discussing politics in a household that discussed politics, in a community that discussed politics. And we were able to discuss politics, disagree with people. And for the most part, unless they were totally out on the fringe, be able after the conversation to say, okay, I can, maybe I can or can't accept what you say, but I can credit you with the right and the humanity of what you're saying. Today, I don't think that's true anymore. So many people, you can't talk to them because they're on their side and your side is dead wrong. It's the MSNBC versus Fox News kind of thing. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about this class is your attitude of trying to teach us how can we talk to each other about things that matter? Because when you don't talk about them, it's worse. And I think, it extends to Israel, it extends to our policies in Israel, but it extends to everything that we do today.
Yeah. Sarah and then Linda.
Was the original question of how did the American attitude change toward Israel?
No, no, that wasn't my intention. Although I think that's probably part of the potentially part of some of the questions that I think people are probably wanting to talk about. No, the question is sort of like how does our community handle differences about Israel and Israeli politics, right?
I think that there's less giving of money through federation, even though the federation drive has been doing well here. I think that people are not sending their money over as fast or supporting the country as a whole.
Okay. Linda?
Well, I was thinking of the issue of women praying at the wall.
Yeah.
How it's viewed in Israel, it depends what perspective you have. I mean, they passed a law that it's supposed to be that women are supposed to be allowed to pray at the main part, but it's never been implemented. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's been considered sort of an intolerable deviance, right, by people in the Orthodox rabbinate and people on the right, and it's intolerable deviance so much so that even though that there is an agreed upon there's an agreement about how to move forward, the Israeli governments have not been able to, or do not feel like they have the political wherewithal, precisely because of the nature of the coalition process in Israel. They have not felt that they have the power to actually institute the agreement without also simultaneously affecting their ability to even govern. Right. So 100%. That's also an example of this whole question of sort of intolerable deviance, but from certain community. I think the question for us and this is the sort of the why, and Janice and Joel, why don't you go first, then I'll follow up.
Well, I just wanted to say we did see that film where it wasn't just an intolerance, but they were actually violent against the women who were bringing their Torah to the wall and trying to pray there. It's and the government turned their head. The police force or whatever did nothing to stop the violence.
So as we're sort of talking about Israel in the Jewish community, and sort of one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring this discussion to Sage this year, is that we as American Jews, when it comes to questions of Jewish practice, when it comes to issues of kashrut and intermarriage, and who is a Jew and conversions, and so many different things that we sort of talked about, same-sex marriage, about Shabbat, gender, right, sexual identity. When it comes to issues around Jewish practice within a synagogue or whatnot, we have an unbelievable and tremendous sense of pluralism on so many issues. And somehow, or even tolerance on so many issues, right? Tolerance that the diversity of Judaism, of the Jewish community, can in fact tolerate, all these different perspectives. But somehow, when it comes to the conversation about Israel, we seem to not have that tolerance. And there's something about the sort of potentially the dual identity of North American Jews and you know, our experience as Jews and as you know, North Americans that actually really affect our ability to even have this sort of conversation. And it's a type of political polarization that is actually not good for us as a community, and not good for for Israel. And the concern that I have here is that even when we're talking about issues like peace and with Palestinians, that it is absolutely important for the North American Jewish community to be engaging in conversations and to not see the dialogue as beyond the pale, to not create sort of a cancel culture of people who have different, have differences of opinions and different attitudes towards Israel, is because our hope is that the kind of pluralism and tolerance that we can create a type of tent and opening to have a conversation with various differences of opinions that also allow for less dogmatic and more inclusive opinions. And frankly, if we're able to do that, if we're able to have that type of discourse around Israel that is not angry and is not alarmist, then we're going to be able to actually have a better relationship with Israel.
Rabbi?
And yeah, Judy.
I have a question. Where does the support of the Christian community come into all this? I was just driving down the street the other day and I saw the bumper sticker, "We are for Israel." Where, as a Jew, do I feel? Does that make me feel better? Does that make me feel worse? That's another factor in all this.
Yeah, and yeah, that is a different factor that I'm not getting, which is
right,
which is also like, what is, and look, there are some Jewish communities who have seen the Christian support of Israel as being an absolutely a-okay thing, and some Jewish communities who've been super concerned that the baggage that it comes with is not worth the support.
But it exists. That's the thing.
Yes,
it's another factor.
Rabbi, I just want to ask a question about your previous comment, and that is, do you sense, in terms of this conversation issue, that the Reformed Jewish rabbinic community has been very leery of using the bima, the pulpit, to talk about their approaches in this area, about having a conversation about Israel?
100%.
And is the CCR or URJ doing anything about that, either in education or in providing information that maybe there needs to be more discussion and dialogue from our religious leaders in local Jewish communities and synagogues? I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenge, I think that it's engaging conversations like this and trying to make this part of the norm of the conversation that has to happen about Israel, because the part of the problem is that if I say something, look, there are times where I have made statements about Israel where there are people in our congregation who are, Israel, you're either, with her or you're against her, right? And I have made a statement that has had some nuance, complexity about my perspective, not speaking on behalf of the congregation, but just speaking. And there are people who have just hit me over the head around, you're either with Israel or you're against Israel, which is just a black and white polarity that I personally think lacks some nuance and some conversation, and creates an intolerable deviance of anyone who holds a different position. Likewise, and I really mean this, I've also made statements about Israel, the same statement, maybe the exact same statement that I was talking about earlier, right? And there will be people who will say to me, Israel, right? If you can't support it, right? And your statement is also likewise an intolerable deviance. And what I'm trying to say is that what that does to reform rabbis, to Jewish communities, whatever, is it makes the desire to talk about and engage and converse about Israel less and less and less and less, because of why go into that foray? Why even engage in that? And the less that we engage in that, the worse it actually is long term for our communities and for and you know, as a synagogue, for our relationship, and for Israel, for our relationship with Israel. And I think that's the problem. The problem, you know, is just that we're getting into a place where somehow the intolerable deviances are screaming that something is, or people are screaming about the intolerable deviance of it. And at the same time, it's if you look at it in relative to issues like any other Jewish religious issue or political issue that we have, we need to find a place where we can get to a place of more tolerance. And there's just not as much tolerance around discussing the Israel-Palestinian issue in the Jewish community than as there should be.
Thank you.
All right, with that, what we're going to talk about next time is sort of the Israel that we imagine, and the conversation is not, you know, we're going from, you know, living with difference to a conversation and exploring sort of different narratives and assumptions about Israel and its goals and its purposes and its significance in our lives. And so we're going to be discussing, and that's important, because as we can, you know, continuing our sort of differing positions are the consequence of different visions and aspirations that we have for Israel, and our differing positions about, and the consequences for the, you know, those different visions are all connected to what we see as tolerable or intolerable, or, you know, deviant, a deviance, an intolerable deviance, or a tolerable deviance, and that all is connected to what we hope and we vision for Israel too. And that's what we're going to be discussing at our next stage. So with that, we're going to allow people to go into more conversations. I hope that you have a chance to read the article from Rabbi Hartman, and I thank you for attending Sage today.
Superb program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
It was
you.
really interesting.